right, welcome everybody to Resiliency Rounds. This is Resiliency Rounds with Anish and Jeremy, and this is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2. And we're going to try and see if we can cover the whole thing in one fair swoop, but it might not be possible. We see how far we get along in the book. Just to give everybody a little bit of a prelude, so we started with Book 1, and when Aristotle laid some ground rules down, one of the ground rules he put down was, who is the intended audience? And so the intended audience are those who are seeking knowledge and they are willing to learn from someone who has the knowledge. And that person in this case is Aristotle himself, according to Aristotle. Now, from our perspective, we agreed that we are going to read the book and try not to be critiques. We're going to try to agree with Aristotle as much as we can. And also, we also agreed that it's hard to disagree with Aristotle given his, just his abilities, his acumen, intellect. He is the forefather of thought. It makes it easier for us to kind of agree with some of his arguments. But it's good to have some skepticism. That's one. Second thing is that we should not get too caught up in the specifics. Some of these discussions they lead astray if you are sticking to the specifics, and so you got to be a little bit general, and it's other places you got to be specific, and so it's a little bit of a dance, a delicate dance that you have to do. That's the other one. So those are the ground rules, and then he starts off with in book 1 saying, why are we doing any of this? And from in his perspective, it is because we're all seeking something, and for humans, any rational beings that can differentiate between good and bad are seeking for good things, and the end of all ends is happiness. The biggest, greatest good that a rational being can aim for is happiness with a capital H, which consists of many small h happinesses and many small g goods. And in order to achieve capital H happiness, one has to be on the path of virtue, that is right action. And so that's where book 1 ends. And so then he goes into what these virtues are, and he tries to give his definition of what these virtues can look like in the sphere of human emotion, human action, and just human life in general. So that's the prelude up till now. Jeremy, I'm gonna ask you to lead us off now with your thoughts on book 2, and then I'll fill in.
Sure. So he starts right at the very beginning with starting to define virtue and
Mm-hmm.
how to look at virtue as either moral virtues or intellectual virtues, right? And so I think we could spend a little time just defining or explaining what he means by moral virtue versus an intellectual virtues, and then we get into talking about there's a continuum, right? And we can talk about the mean and where people fall in virtue is somewhere between extremes. And so we can talk about what that looks like. But so I'll start with moral virtue, right? So moral virtues are things like courage, generosity, temperance, and moral virtues are something that could be the result of habit, right? So it takes practice. It's not something that you were just born with. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, well, yeah. What do you think about that?
Well, I love the debate of nurture versus nature, uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I tend to agree that I think these are things that you can absolutely learn and grow, and maybe for some it's easier, but I also think um, that the environment that you're around has an impact on the choices you make and the habits you create. What do you
Yeah,
think?
yeah. The the way he says also the way he makes the point of this is that intellectual virtue is something that one acquires through study
Mm-hmm.
and through experience. One is not born with it, and I believe the intellectual virtue. When he says it's learned, what that means is through experience, and that is practical wisdom, is what he's talking about. The moral virtue that he's talking about is something that one is not necessarily born with an understanding of what moral virtues are, but one has, as a rational being, one has the basic toolkit to be able to build these moral virtues. And so they are not innate in the sense that one is born with a set of morals and ethics, but the ability to develop those morals and ethics are innate to a rational being. And the way one then goes from having the ability to be moral or have moral virtue is by practicing those acts. And there is a little bit of a yin and yang kind of thing here. I see a flavor of Taoism here, where one has to, in order to be just, temperate, courageous, one has to do just, temperate, and courageous acts. And by doing just, temperate, and courageous acts, one becomes a just person, and a virtuous person. Mm-hmm. And a virtuous person is one who does just, temperate, and courageous acts. So it becomes like a circle. So, where do you start in this circle? When is it that you can say that you're a virtuous person? And he does explain this later on. He does a pretty good job getting us there logically.
Right.
What did you think about that? Did you get the learn and then do goes into learn again? Did you get that cycle?
Yeah, it's like a feedback loop, right? Yeah. So do, then learn and do, and yeah, and so like intellectual virtues is wisdom over time, right? It's something that you learn. It's teachings. It's expanding perspective. So I like how you differentiate between the two, and and the habits. So if you or so for moral virtues, yeah, I think you mentioned this. I just want to point out it's not doing it once. It's actually the act of doing it many times over and over again, right? So
that's correct.
If you do a courageous act one time, that doesn't make you courageous, on a grander scale.
Right. So, yeah. Right. And also doing it. And so, yeah, there's another thing that we should underscore is that moral virtues in his definition has to do with pleasure and pain. Right. And these virtues, it is in fact harder to do the right thing, and it is usually painful to do the right thing. But if you're doing the right thing and you are pained by doing the right thing, that is not necessarily a virtuous thing or the right thing to do for you. You see what I mean is that one cannot say that I'm a courageous person while they're performing a courageous act. They actually don't like the feeling that they get of performing the act. Right. And so there is a little bit of that pleasure and pain dynamic that he brings in as well. But he does say that this ability to understand that this act is a courageous act, or this is what a temperate person should be, or this is a just act, it takes some amount of practical wisdom. That practical wisdom is learned through participating in life, by participating and performing all of these acts and figuring out what is and what is not virtuous, what is and what is not painful or pleasureful. And that the that process, though, of learning and doing should start really early.
Mhm.
But one cannot say that a, a kid is, or a child or a young man is virtuous in their deeds, because in order to become a virtuous person, it takes practical wisdom. Practical wisdom requires several cycles of iteration and really coming to understand whether these acts that you're doing are in line with what a just or a courageous person or a temperate person would do. So, but it is strange because there are two different aspects here. One is the self driven aspect to this, right? When one looks in the mirror, when Anish is looking in the mirror and Anish is asking, Anish, are you a just person? Are you a temperate or a courageous person? That's a whole different journey than if I'm looking at Jeremy and I'm saying, hey, is Jeremy a just person? Is Jeremy a courageous person? Right? Those are two very different things. Now, in Aristotle's case, which is very different from what Plato says, in the Republic, it's all about the personal journey. It's got nothing to do with anybody else.
Right.
It doesn't. As a matter of fact, the whole argument in the Republic is if nobody believes you to be a just person, but you know you are a just person, would you be happy? And it turns out that Socrates proves that that's the case. It's got nothing to do with anybody else. As a
Right.
matter of fact, if you are unjust inside and everybody believes you to be just, you would be an unhappy person. And that's usually not what conventional wisdom says, right? Conventional wisdom says, who cares? If everybody thinks you're a good person, then you will reap the benefits of that.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, you'll be eaten up hollow on the inside. Aristotle is trying to take a ground where he's being more practical. He's saying, yes, there's a journey of you, an individual aspect of this, but there's also the aspect of one trying to be a political creature, trying to influence others, trying to lead nations, trying to have conversations that are bigger than them. And that situation is important how you're perceived as well. So, um, so the acts that one performs is is relative. Sorry, the moral or the ethical or the virtual, or not virtual, the virtuous act that one performs is relative to one's own inner feelings and is also relative to what a virtuous person would perform. You can measure yourself up against a virtuous person and say, I the act I've done, does it add up? Does it compare to this other virtuous person? Similarly, someone could look at you and you could say this act that this person performed, is it just a virtuous act or not, based on their understanding of what a just person should do? And you see, it gets really hard to control the narrative when it is outside or external to you. I read these books mostly thinking about it from a self-improvement perspective, really.
Sure. Yeah.
And I don't know if you got that feeling or not. This is like a feeling that I kind of I get. These are lecture series, right? So he's trying to deliver this to somebody
Right.
and expecting them to kind of improve themselves, but he's also giving it to people who will be judged on a public level. So
Right. Well, yeah, I think that there's a key theme that sticks out for me or stands out for me, which is individual differences.
mhm,
So we all have our own uniqueness, and then we all the definition of virtue then by nature is different based on your view, Anish, and my view, right? If I'm
yeah,
uncomfortable doing something that you're doing that is virtuous, that's not virtuous for me, but it might be for you, right? So
yeah,
it's a great concept, and I think when you start to think too about the kind of bigger picture is this idea of nature versus nurture that we start with is thinking about modern day or back then, talking about bigger picture political, like running communities and cities and governments, and well, that person's not virtuous. It creates a culture that is potentially not virtuous that impacts. So how do people learn then to be
right,
virtuous in an environment that is not conducive for that?
right,
Yeah.
right. It's interesting if one is trying to look around in their society or in what's going on conventionally, and then trying to make up their mind about what is good and what is evil, then you are right. What happens in that situation is one could easily get led astray.
Mhm.
One could very easily find themselves participating in some sort of genocide. Just because you just look around you conventionally and say, oh, these people, according to the government, according to the authority, these people are not good people, and so whatever is happening to them, they are subhuman, and they deserve this. As a matter of fact, you lose they in your mind they lose humanity. They're not human. They've done something wrong, and that's why they get this injustice is. You don't believe it's injustice that's being meted out to them. You believe it's justice because you tie into the conventional what's going on, right? That's what ends up happening mostly. You could see that that's what probably happened in Nazi Germany, right?
Exactly. The banality of evil.
The banality
Yes.
of evil. That's right. Now you had mentioned that before. That's
Yeah.
exactly, and that's why I think it's important to understand that this is a personal journey, because if one participates in the great conversation, right? If one has read the Republic, and one understands what does it mean to be virtuous, if you're going to use a paragon of virtue like Socrates, and you're going to compare you're going to compare yourself to Socrates, you could say, what would Socrates do in this situation? Right? And you can ask yourself that, and then you can decide whether you should probably do that or not do that, rather than saying, what would this, you know, candidate who's standing for elections do?
Right.
You see, so this gives you an opportunity to compare, and it's not about comparing the candidate in front of you to Socrates. I mean, that's not what this is about. This is comparing yourself to Socrates and saying, where are you aligned? And then, so in my mind, I always ask myself, well, what would Socrates do? Is a great way to think about this, right?
So you're using Socrates as the baseline,
Yeah,
right? Is
and
yeah.
you see how that works, right? You could use there are individuals in history that have exemplified this the pursuit of virtue,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? And it is in that situation it gets easier to compare ourselves to them, and also, and I say it's not even that, right? It's also about when you're on the path and you're seeking this difference, you're trying to figure out in your rational principle, your apex principle, you're trying to build the ability to differentiate between good and evil. You're constantly asking yourself, you're constantly questioning what you see around yourself. You're constantly worried about that. What maybe the way you think about something is just your opinion, and that opinion is maybe not even true opinion. It's not the truth. We don't know what the truth is, but it may be not even true opinion. It's false opinion, and you could be led astray. So if you keep questioning that,
Mhm.
right, then you are less likely to be led astray by somebody else in society, if you and or by the undertone in society. So I think a lot of moral virtue comes from choosing the right yardstick. Yes, it is relative to you, but that relativity is not a relativity in the sense that one could say that I can only do this level of, I can exemplify this level of courage, or I can show this level of justice, this level of temperance, given my social situation, given my place in society, and then and and whatever bar is met, you say, well, that's a high bar, and I have met that bar, and I'm a just, temperate, and courageous person. Well, you'll be leading yourself astray, because all you will have to ask yourself, has there been another individual who's shown a higher level of courage, higher level of temperance and justice, and paid an ultimate price, right? If that is the case, then, and you haven't met that bar, well, you still have a lot of learning to do. You see what I mean? Now that means you still have to practice the act. You keep doing the acts and build your character. And while you're doing those things, you will at some point come to understand that you will take pleasure in the fact that you're doing things that are harder. Those things have consequences, but those things are leading you to the path of justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. And at some point, you do turn into that individual that you have been idealizing. And you do that for someone else. Someone else looks at you and says, you know what, I want to be Jeremy because Jeremy exemplifies justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. But Jeremy doesn't idealize himself as that. Jeremy looks at Socrates and says, you see what I mean?
So Jeremy's still working on it, right? And
Jeremy's always working on it.
you're always working on it. Once you've
Always.
never arrived, you're always questioning that, and so you do become that person over time to someone else,
To
right?
someone else.
Yes.
But that is not the intent. What happens is, if you start seeing, am I being perceived as a just person or not? If you're honor seeking, if then that becomes a problem. If you're wisdom seeking, then you really don't care about what someone else thinks about you. You're always on the path. And guess what? Being on that path is what leads to happiness, right? We
Right.
discussed this in the last episode,
Right.
right?
Right.
It is you're always on the path of virtue. You never step aside saying that I've arrived. There's no arriving.
Right.
And if you're constantly on that path, no matter where you are in your journey, no matter what befalls you, you're able to deal with whatever befalls you better because you're always seeking, and so you have a higher chance of achieving a higher state of happiness than if you step off the path at any time or say my journey's ended.
Right. What's interesting about that, there's a lot of, a few thoughts, but happiness doesn't come easily, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you're constantly challenging yourself to say, well, all right, I feel like I was just in this scenario, or, oh, or I've been doing all these actions and this is where my bar was, but no, I'm not there. Like, I need to now challenge myself to be even more virtuous and more courageous and more generous. And so it's just an interesting thought, right? I mean, how you're happy living this life, but it's also very challenging, very complex.
Yeah. And isn't there beauty in that? Because there is, as you do these acts, doing these acts is hard. As you do them, they get easier. As they get easier, you step up the game. You take it to another level, and that level is hard. And then it gets easier. Then it gets hard again. It gets easier. You can never master any of these. You can
Right.
never master courage or master temperance or master justice. There's always levels of this that are beyond, and there is a sort. And that's the beautiful game. Like it's a complex problem that you'll never be able to completely solve,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that is a life well lived,
That is a life well lived. Yes.
right? As opposed to keeping like this very low bar and stepping over that bar every so often and saying, you know what, yeah, I donate, I send some money here and there or whatever, I participate in my local charity or whatever, and that I'm a good, just and temperate person. Like, as opposed to, you keep challenging yourself, it gets easier, and you derive more pleasure from it as time goes on. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
That trajectory is a very different trajectory.
Yeah. Yeah. So this whole idea of self development, and the individual self kind of learning through this process. What I love about it is, in order to do this, it requires constant inquiry. So you're always assessing where you are and what you're doing, and so there's always self reflection and asking yourself, and maybe asking others.
Very well said, right? And not just, sometimes the asking could be reading.
Mhm.
It could be this,
Yeah.
right? When you read, you ask yourself, are you keeping up with those standards that are laid down? And um and 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 you can compare yourself to the acts that others have done ahead of you, who you believe are honorable people, and you can now compare your acts to them. That's an
Right.
ongoing conversation. That very well said. I agree that path of self development is never ending. It's also not a competition. If there is a competition, it's only with oneself.
Right.
Right? One gets to look at one where one was and now where one has come. Um, yeah, I think that's very well said. I agree. Um, so, what did you think about that aspect that he says? He draws a distinction. He says, just because, and you said this too, that just because someone does a courageous act this just once, or someone is forced by someone else to do a courageous act, right? Is that person a courageous person?
Yeah. And Aristotle would say no,
Yeah.
and I would agree. Yeah.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Just doing the right thing once in a while is good, to your point, but it's the continuous act in process of reflecting on it. Um, and I mean, how many of us in our day to day or ever actually have this conversation of, for me today, Jeremy, what are my, am I being virtuous? And where does that fall? Am I comparing myself to a niche, or am I comparing myself to Socrates?
Right.
Or, what would Socrates do? I haven't asked myself that question before. That would be a really interesting question for me to go through. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that and then saying again, like, yes, you can do it on a daily level. There are opportunities to exercise virtue on a daily level.
Mhm.
Uh, sorry, on a daily basis at every level. Um, I do believe that most of our conventional lives, the way they are right now, the opportunities are not as abundant as one would like to believe. And so one has to actually go out into the world and find spheres where one can exercise virtue. Otherwise, one can get very easily caught up in performing very small v virtuous acts as opposed to larger v virtuous acts. And there's nothing wrong with that. What I'm trying to say is that you have to start somewhere. It's the learn and do, and that cycle has to start somewhere. It's good to start, but to your point, it has to be continuous. You have to also reflect on it, right? And it has to be a choice. Like, if you put it this way, say you're sitting at home, right? And you know your your wife says, hey, listen, or your spouse or your kids or someone says, hey, uh, let's go participate in this particular fundraiser or whatever, right? In your mind, you're going, man, I could care less. I'd rather be sitting and watching football or whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
And you drag yourself off the couch and you do it, and you're miserable while you're doing it, and you come back and you sit in your chair and you go, man, what the heck. Now, yes, you did a good act. You did it, but you did it hesitantly. You didn't think while you were doing it that it is in fact participating in something greater than yourself. And when it got done, you're like, I don't know if I'll ever do it again. Like, it never felt that good. It didn't feel that good. That is not necessarily an act that you could check off the box saying, you know what, this was in fact a good thing that I did. From the standpoint of, if you're really trying to build virtue, one has to, there are some qualifiers that Aristotle lays out for the agent. The qualifiers are, one has to have knowledge. What I mean is knowledge of what is in fact virtue. What is justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom? What does it mean? Can you describe to me? Can you not describe to me, but describe to yourself, like, what they are? Can you write them down? So that's knowledge, not only of virtue, but can you also, do you have knowledge of who a virtuous person is, who a just, temperate, courageous, and wise person is? Do you have knowledge of those things? Then, do you choose to perform this or not? And what choice is a very strange thing. A lot of it focuses on free will. And I think there's something that we should discuss here about choice. How much choice do we really have in this matter? But if we believe free will exists, if we have a contingent free will or not, or whatever, given the opportunity, we discussed the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're somebody who has come to a point where, you have all the trappings of your conventional life, including your philosophical needs, sorry, physiologic needs, love, security, you have a job and all of that. Now you're in a position where you could make a choice to self-actualize and transcend. So if you get there, you have the knowledge, you can choose, and you choose the action not for anything else, but for the action itself without secondary gain.
Right.
It's not like I'm doing this because Jeremy would say, oh, Anish, you're a virtuous guy, or so let me felicitate you for that. Like, that's secondary gain, or I'm going to get money out of it, or I'm going to get elected to office, or whatever be that thing. And not only that, you also have to do it. It's not good enough to do it just once. You have to do it consistently.
Mhm.
One has to have knowledge of what is justice, temperance, courage, and wisdom. Who is a virtuous agent, or the right agent that you would follow? Who's the paragon of that? You need to have chosen to do this by choice, without secondary gain, and consistently. Because you could perform an action without these qualifiers,
Right.
but you would not be a virtuous person You see what I mean? Now,
Yes, I do. Yeah.
what do you think about that? Like, because there is something to be said about a person like that too, which I think most of us are in that situation where we don't have all of these prerequisite qualifications, but
Right.
that doesn't necessarily mean that that we have no chance. So before I move ahead, I want to get your thoughts on those prerequisites: knowledge, choice, secondary gain, consistency.
Well, it makes sense to me, and I'm wondering, does that if someone had all those prerequisites, is the virtuous person selfless? Is that
That's a great question.
yeah?
Yeah, because what is being selfless, right? I guess. Yeah, nice. Tell me, what do you think?
Well, I think so. I also, so I'm holding this idea of selflessness here because that's what I'm hearing from those prerequisites, and
Yeah.
I'm also hearing, that the virtuous person is that the other question then is that a leader?
Uh,
And, and is it a servant leader? I mean, these are I'm looking at the prerequisites to go into here. Those are kind of the themes that stand out to me of like, well, what does that actually mean then to have the knowledge, know who the right agent is to compare yourself to without secondary gain, be consistently doing these behaviors or these acts. Then without secondary gain, I think is where I'm coming up primarily with the selflessness, right? I mean, you're not doing it for yourself, so
yeah, that one is very interesting because I do believe if you if one agrees with the first premise that every rational agent is trying to seek something, and that something at the end of the day is capital H happiness, but it's capital H happiness for themselves.
right,
So then, if everything you do for capital H happiness for oneself, then is it really a selfless
right,
act, right?
yeah,
But I think there are levels to secondary gain. I think every act is a selfish act. But of
mm-hmm.
all the reasons why one could be selfish, if a selfish act leads to capital H happiness, that means you're looking for a virtuous end. That means you are exercising you're performing action to affect the capital G good, universal good, good for everybody else. You're performing an act that is to the benefit of everybody else. The only thing you get out of it is the sense of purpose, the sense of having participated in the act. You see what I mean? Of
Yeah,
all the secondary gains, that is probably the highest level of gain that one can have. What I mean by highest level, in the sense the most elevated level. There is nothing else in there that is conventional in any way, shape, or form. So maybe the secondary gain here is more conventional secondary gain, like honor, wealth, power, uh, influence, or something as silly as even pleasure and things like that.
right.
Uh, but in the lack of that, then I think that's what I believe the secondary gain here is, because there is a gain, and the gain is, like I said, capital H happiness, which I think is at a different level.
Yeah.
Now, to your point, well, whether this person is a leader or not, I don't know, Jeremy, because this person could be anybody. None of these are visible to you
Mm-hmm.
or me, right? Our neighbor could be this virtuous agent.
Right.
We wouldn't know,
Wouldn't know. Yeah.
right? Because it depends upon the sphere of action, right? Right?
Sphere
Like,
of influence, sphere
yeah.
of action. Yeah. Yeah.
And so, if one is not involved in that sphere of action, one would not know who the agent is,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Right. Yeah.
So, but could it be a leader? Should it? The question that you're asking, I think you're asking Aristotle's question: should leaders be virtuous agents?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's leading by saying, is a good leader virtuous versus the question of should a leader be virtuous?
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah,
Correct. Because leaders come in all shapes and sizes, and one doesn't get to really choose. How does one know,
right.
right?
Yeah.
So there is Plutarch was a Roman was a biographer in a sense. So he wrote a lot of these biographies of all these famous Roman, at the time of Rome's greatness, and the Romans were heavily influenced by the Greeks and the Greek philosophy, and so he created these biographies that are fictitious biographies of the person who founded Sparta and the person who founded Rome. So there's Lycurgus versus Numa. Lycurgus is the fictitious general, I think he is, who formed Sparta, and Numa is this fictitious uh, aristocrat who founded Rome. And both of them knew in their minds that they were virtuous agents. They were on the path of virtue, but um, the difference between the two was Lycurgus felt that because of his higher calling, he needed to form the state of Sparta, and he actively participated in it. Numa had to be forced to do it. And the reason why Numa ends up, he was asked by a group of people to come to lead the formation of Rome, and he initially said no, but then eventually convinced himself, saying that that yes, this is going to be time consuming. It's going to be hard. It's going to take away from my peace and happiness that I've built for myself. But I would not be able to live myself if someone who is less of a virtuous agent than me leads to the formation of Rome, because that would undermine the common good.
Right.
And there is as you read so the two biographies are in contrast to one another. It is written that way, in contrast with one another, to see what happens to Lycurgus and then what happens to Numa. But the point here is that it is one could create a fictional biography of the virtuous agent. In real life, what ends up happening is virtuous agents are assassinated.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, they're a threat.
They are a threat to
They're a
conventional
threat.
ways.
Yeah. And sorry. So modern day example though is just the movie Gladiator, right?
Yeah,
Maximus Aurelius is being asked to bring Rome back to the people, and he doesn't want to do it, and yet he needs to do it. And what happens? You know, attempted assassination. But,
right.
yeah,
Right. So that the like if you look at even if you look at more recently, right? Like that's what ends up happening. So Mahatma Gandhi assassinated, Martin Luther King
right,
assassinated, right? But Socrates put to death,
right,
right? So these are all examples of society doesn't know what to do with people like this. They're scared of people who are able to carry these, who are virtuous agents. And so Nelson Mandela is a great example of somebody who, not only survived, but ended up, taking on power, relinquishing power, and then dying peacefully. Very few examples like that.
yeah.
So to your point, yes, should there be leaders? Yes, but unfortunately, the world doesn't work like
That's right.
that. um,
Well, and so that's actually, and I'll segue then into this idea of pain and pleasure,
yeah,
right? And then that a virtuous person takes pleasure in good actions is the concept that Aristotle's talking about. But along those lines, the non-virtuous person, I would argue, is experiencing pleasure from the bad acts.
from that, yes,
Right. And the virtuous person would not experience pleasure. But now we're looking at, our society today, and is it dopamine hits? Is that right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a lot
Yeah.
of dopamine hits we get from things we shouldn't be doing that are not virtuous.
Yeah. Yeah. The counter, I don't know if the counter is necessarily true or not. I think there are some acts that are just inherently pleasurable, but they may not necessarily be virtuous acts. But I
Right.
think being just a human, um, so he talks about this. It's a good point. He talks about this, right? Like the he kind of dissects the human brain in a way. He says there's a part of us that is it is it's kind of a base level, which is I think he does this in maybe chapter one. I don't know if he went over this or not, but he says that there are some things that humans share in common with all beings. That is the physiologic functions, growth, nutrition, things like that. You don't control it, and just because you have it doesn't make you a good person or a bad person.
Mhm.
And then there are certain things that like eating, drinking, participating in activities of daily living. Well, you share that with horses and dogs. That doesn't necessarily make you anything greater doing those things. And that is for a lot of people most of our lives, actually, right? So then what separates you? So it's the rational principle, the one that you could that you could choose to do or not do painful or uncomfortable things just because you want to transcend to another level. Now that is the rational principle. But that part of your mind that allows you to act outside of the sphere of what is being driven by necessity, by your um, by what's the term for it, by just the traits of being like an animal, right? Beyond nutrition, beyond urges, like that part of it that you control, quote unquote, has two levels. One part that's subservient to the other part, and that part that's subservient to the other part is the one that is a pleasure seeking element. Now, one can sit and say, you know what, I'm not hungry, but I want to eat the donut. I just like eating donuts. Like I just like the sweet taste of donuts, right? And then there's a principle that says, no, you shouldn't be doing that. If you do that, you're going to get heart disease, right? So then the part that says I want to eat the donut says, you know what? Yeah, forget it. I'm not going to have the donut. I'm going to skip a donut for today, right? So there's a part that's subservient to that. So there's a rational principle that knows eating donuts is bad. There's a part that wants to eat donuts because it feels good, and so
Right.
there's that relationship,
Mhm.
right? And so to come back to the point that you made, that I do believe um, that there are certain acts that one does, like this is a very silly, a pithy example of eating a donut. But even if you're a very just or virtuous, courageous person, eating donut feels good.
That's right. Yep. Yep.
And it's not that eating a donut makes you feel bad. And if you deny yourself a donut and you're craving a donut, well, guess what? Then you're not a temperate person.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Mhm.
Even temperance should be performed in moderation. So it's okay. There are certain acts that really don't make one virtuous or not virtuous. There's some acts that you just do. You don't have to sit and worry about. If you cannot sit and think about every act that you do, oh, is this a courageous act, is this just act, eat a donut, man. you know don't. But there are other spheres in life where one needs to act. So I would say that, to your point, there are acts that require courage, and as you're performing them you are fearful, but
Mhm.
when you perform them you feel good, if one is a person who's trying to become a courageous person,
Yeah.
or one is a courageous person. Similarly, there are acts that are courageous, one is fearful while doing it, one still does it, but at the end of it feels badly about it. That person is not trying to be a courageous person. Even if they are, maybe they are, because I think there's a caveat to be said here. They are not courageous just yet.
Right.
So what I mean to say is that the agent, the virtuous agent who has knowledge, choice, no secondary gain, and is consistent, well, that person is a virtuous agent. But for the rest of us common folk, we do those acts maybe with incomplete knowledge, but the prerequisite there is we are seeking. I think that is the minimum prerequisite. You
Yeah.
cannot just by chance end up doing something good.
Right.
You know? there's a there's a joke, but this is my dad's joke. Like the people, all these guys are standing on this bridge, and they're looking down on the water, and there's this guy who's like flailing in the water. He's like drowning. It's a river. Like they can see him. He's flailing and he's asking for help. And suddenly, nobody's ready to go into this raging water, right? Suddenly, there's this loud splash, and this guy just, you know, is in the water. He's like swimming towards this guy, and he catches him, and then he somehow brings him to the shore. And everybody comes cheering down to this guy who dived into the water, and they're lifting him up on the shoulder and they're cheering him on, saying, my gosh, look at you saved this guy. He says, just let all that be. Who's the guy who pushed me into the water? Find me that guy. So, you see what I mean? Like, that is not necessarily a courageous act. So you don't want to be that guy,
right?
So I think having some prerequisite, but even if you don't have all those other things, right? You have some choice, you have some knowledge, you have some secondary gain, and you're probably doing it inconsistently. But the more you do it, the easier it gets. The learn-do cycle continues, and eventually you find yourself in this loop. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean, and that's building habits. And I was thinking about that in terms of habits form over time. Behavior change happens over time. Behavior change is not easy to do.
Nope.
If you're actively trying to change a behavior, it's going to take 6 to 9 months of truly making it a habit,
right?
Trying something different and putting yourself in uncomfortable situations to make that happen. So building this muscle of virtuous habits is something that courageous, I think, is a great one to use as the example, because I think it might be one of the harder ones to do. I think generosity is something that could come easier if you are intentional about doing that.
Right.
But courageous is stepping out into a lot of uncomfortable spaces. Honesty is a lot easier. That's right.
Yep. Yeah. And then there are some that you don't even know what it feels. What? How do you know you're performing an act that is in fact just? Right? It just gets hard, and there are levels to this that are kind of beyond your scope, even.
Right.
They're complex.
Which is the interesting thing, because you never really know. I mean, you can reflect back on the actions that you took and say, "Oh, I think that was virtuous," or in this scenario, I think that was the right thing to do. But it's this dichotomy of, like, at the end of the day, it's other people who are perceiving you as virtuous.
Yeah.
Yourself. Well, and so you might be experiencing happiness because you're on that path and you're constantly looking for it, but you don't ever know, because you can't. It's difficult to assess, was that virtuous?
Very difficult.
But in the eyes of others, it potentially was, but you won't know that because you're not necessarily going to get that feedback from others.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you. So this is a great point. What if there's an act one does and one believes it's a virtuous act? One carries that with them through their life, think, you know what? I do this act. This is a great act. And not only that, society really says, oh yeah, this is a great act. Look at you. You're just such a great person. Then you realize, as your life goes on, and maybe as you're coming closer and closer to your death, that in fact that act was not, in fact, what all you thought it turned out to be. It actually had consequences that were beyond, that were probably counter to what you thought it was. Now, whether or not the tide changes and people blame you for the act, that is a whole nother thing. But how does one live with oneself, right? If one believes one is a virtuous person, one has followed this path, they're going for the capital H happiness, suddenly it turns out the act that you did not get you there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. No, it's a great point. And in today's day and age, a lot of us are thinking that people were acting virtuously, and in fact, we are not, right? And that's a whole other thing, right? It's just you're on the path of what you think is virtuous, and only half the people think you are, and half the people think you're not.
And that's true. See, that's the other thing. That's why the journey is all within. Like, one has to look at the mirror, because at the end of the day, right? If you believe the republic, it doesn't matter what the people think. What do you truly believe? And you cannot and honestly, it's very difficult to lie to oneself if one is in fact a rational person, right? Mm-hmm. So I think there's something to be said, and I wrote that down somewhere. Yeah. So This is where it's important. So he says that um, an individual who has the ability to eventually be a just or a virtuous person, you know, all individuals have passions, they have faculties and states of character. And the way I look at it is passions are things that are related to pleasures and pain. These are actually emotions. These are, you know, being sad, being angry, things like that, being happy, so these are signs, these are emotions, these are states of being that we really don't have a choice. It's like the lizard brain. One cannot be blamed or praised for being happy or for being sad or for being angry. Okay, I take that back. For feeling sad, for feeling happy, for feeling angry, one can feel all of these things and you really don't have any control over it. But there are there are faculties, and faculties is what gives you the ability to actually express that. So that means that one could be angry and one can express anger, or one could be angry and may not express anger. Right?
Yeah.
That is a choice in a way. Okay. And then there's a state of character. One could be somebody who gets angry very easily and constantly stays in a state of anger. Everything makes them angry. Right? That's a state of character. Even that is a choice. Now, what I mean to say is passions are not a choice. If I stub my toe on a wall, and I give this example, you say you're standing in line at a grocery store, right? And someone just pushes you out of the line. And you're just standing there, minding your own business. You get pushed out of the line. And for a moment there, you feel irritation, you feel anger. You turn around, right? And it turns out it was an old person who just stumbled and pushed you out of the way, right? You're not going to take a swing at that person. Right?
Hopefully not.
Hopefully not, right? But having said that, you cannot blame yourself for being irritated at having been pushed. I mean, that's something that you cannot really control. Like, it's just in you. You see what I mean?
Yes.
So the initial emotion that one has no control, and one cannot be blamed for it. But if you got pushed out of line and you just turned around and you didn't even think and you just swung your fist into this person's face, well, that means you are kind of acting on that irritation that you felt, right? And then you end up hitting this old person, and then you are absolutely, you feel terrible about it, and you say, I'm sorry, I didn't know, or whatever, and you feel terrible about it. That's fine. But what if you do that and you're still angry at that person? That is a poor state of character, right? So you had the passion, you lack the faculty, and you also have a poor state of character. You're like, so what? This person is old, get out of my way, right? So now, if one has the ability, if one does not feel passions, right? There are states of being that are abnormal, but there are some people who are anhedonic, like they just don't feel sensations.
Sure.
No pleasure, no pain, none of that. Well, unfortunately for that person, it gets hard then to be on this path. Like, what I'm trying to say is that it is hard then for this person to be judged to be virtuous or not, because they don't meet that first requirement.
Right. They also might have difficult time actually making it through society, though, at the same time.
It's absolutely true. Yeah. So again, unfortunately, when we say, this person is a virtuous person, this person is not a virtuous person, the first thing we have to ask ourselves, does this person feel pleasure and pain? Is he anhedonic? Well, we don't come across anhedonic people all the time, but maybe there are people like that.
Right.
The second thing is, do they have the ability to control that emotion? So you may have the emotion, but you have the ability to control them. Now, there are lots of reasons why some people don't have the ability to control the emotion, because of prior trauma, PTSD, all of those things come in, right? Like, one could have been abused as a child or whatever. They come from war-torn areas in the Maslow's triad, or the pyramid. They've not had the baseline levels, and so there are all those reasons why they cannot control it. If one grew up in South Chicago or whatever, in some of those places, and you probably have a very different threat level very different ability to, if someone bumps into you, I mean, you probably swing at him because you would expect that in those
Right.
places, that's a threat,
Right.
right? As opposed to in my suburb. And so that is not a choice. That's almost not a choice for some people. You see what I mean? So
Mhm.
then one cannot judge that person to be virtuous or not virtuous because they don't have the ability to control that faculty. And then there are those people who honestly don't have the ability to control their state of character. What I mean is that one is a little bit harder for me to justify, but I mean there are people who are kind of psychotic, like they're sociopaths, psychopaths,
Right.
right? Who feel passions, they act on those passions, and they don't feel any way one way about it. They just that's who they are. It's a quirk of their nature.
Right.
But those people are kind of few and far in between.
Yeah, I was going to say those are the outliers, though, right? And
Correct.
in and this actually gets to kind of Aristotle's idea of there's a mean and you have your
Yeah.
extremes, right? And that the virtuous acts are typically somewhere in the middle of these extremes. But as we've talked about, my middle is different than yours, and so like your example of the getting bumped in line, there are multiple ways in which a person could respond into that act.
Correct.
Self-control and temperance is potentially a virtuous act, right? But you turn around and you say, oh, you recognize it's an elderly person. You pick them up. Are you okay? Might have been a little annoyed, but you forgive them. I turn around, I see an old person, I'm still annoyed, and I choose not to do anything. But I choose not to do anything,
Right.
including I choose not to pick them up. I also choose not to say anything to them or to swing at them. Different mean there, but are both potentially virtuous acts
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
behavior. Yeah,
Right. But the thing is, yes, there is a difference, but the question to ask is what would Socrates do in that situation?
right,
Right.
right.
And then so one is what would Socrates do? But the other thing is one may not have the underpinnings that are required to be able to do those things that Socrates would do.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Socrates had the ability, he felt the passions, had the faculties, and had the state of character. One may not have any of these three things. And so that's why this is about this. That's why I feel like this is about oneself. If one is listening to this conversation, if one is having these conversations, one is reading about this, they probably have all three of these things. And if you have all three of these things and you're still not doing the right thing, ask yourself why, right? And most of the people I know in my life, I can tell you, like, yeah, I was in the same situation, right? I was in a situation where most of my life, I had all of these abilities. I never exercised them, never asked what would Socrates do.
Yeah.
And so it is important then to understand for oneself where one is in this journey, right? And not blame someone else. So you're not trying to find virtue in someone else, or say, that person is not a virtuous person, that person is not a virtuous person. The only finger to point is at oneself, essentially, is what I was trying to get from that. So that was one thing that I wanted to say. And then to your point about so emotions are not a choice. Acting on emotions, if for most of us, is a choice. I find that for myself it's a choice. And that's why I believe that virtuous action is a choice, right? For me, I can only talk about for myself. And if I choose not to perform in a virtuous activity, I have only myself to blame. You see? And it may not necessarily be true for my neighbor. So if one possesses emotion, one possesses the ability to feel these emotions, ability to manage these emotions. This ability to manage this becomes your state of character. And one can change one's state of character. I know, honestly, I can tell you for myself, like anger was I used to get angry very easily. And there were lots of different reasons for it. And I'm not going to give you any excuses, but my point was I've been able to control that much better because of this reason, right? But unfortunately, psychopathy is not a choice,
Right.
right?
It's chemical.
Correct. And one has no say in it,
Right.
and it's just good fortune that I'm not a psychopath.
Right.
Now, you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Now, but I do believe that neurosis is a choice.
Say more. Yeah.
this day-to-day anxiety that one has, right?
Mhm.
If one is sitting there, the crisis that we talk about, right? If you're sitting there and you're asking yourself, like, I'm doing all of these things, why am I not happy? You know, why is my relationship with my spouse not good? Why do I not have any friends? Why do my kids not, talk to me? These are small H's, but they are. Where is this going? Where is this headed? Why do I feel this way? Right? There's a certain neurosis that comes with just the anxiety of just day-to-day living. And that's a choice. One can, if one is asking oneself these questions, right, then I think they have the abilities to be able to then act on that, is what I mean.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It's interesting you brought up free will a few times now, and I feel like that's very much a concept here
Mm,
that you're touching on, which is in most scenarios here, we have the free will to make these choices.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you agree with that? Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about that though? Like, there's a lot of controversy regarding free will. I mean, is it truly free will, right? Because if one doesn't, like we said, if when it comes to these emotions, the ability to act on these emotions and all of that, is psychopathy is not free will
Right.
essentially, right? But when we say free will, I believe when you say free will, you're probably talking about contingent free will. Like, once, if you have the ability, do you exercise the ability? Is that
Right.
what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that there's. Well, I think at the end of the day, I mean, that's what I think Aristotle is talking about here, right? It is that you have these choices. For most of us, have these choices that we can make, um, and as you've mentioned, I think at the beginning too, like this isn't the people who are listening to this conversation or reading these books and having these conversations are at the place where they're ready to ponder this, to think about it, and to assess themselves. And and it's okay for those who just aren't aware yet or aren't ready for it. And in our first session together, we talked about that vertical development, and these diplomats and optimists are in early stages of adult development, of vertical development, and they're not capable of this type of thinking or
Right.
making these type of choices. In fact, they aren't living virtuously. I mean, at the end of the day, they are in it for themselves,
Yeah, yeah. I see
right?
what you mean. Yeah, tell me
So
more.
it's not
Yeah.
until these later stages of development that people are ready to accept, are able to think about how they are coming across in the world, how other people might perceive them, how am I behaving in a way that I want to be behaving and viewed? What is that? What am I a courageous person? Am I a servant leader? Right? I mean, bringing it into today's themes of like what these are all things like you have free will at every stage of adult development, right? I mean, that free will is probably a whole nother. We could spend an hour on free will alone, right? But at the end of the day, like we all have that choice. We have the ability to make these choices, and some of us it's a lot easier. The easier path is not the virtuous path.
It's not the word, but that's correct.
Yeah, yeah. And so you have to be in a certain place ready to challenge yourself and actually to live that virtuous path.
But going back, it was very interesting. Going back to the vertical spectrum, you said the opportunist and the diplomat are not virtuous. Um, and but they have the choice. Would you agree with me if I say that maybe, because, so let me, I mean, I see what you mean by when you say that they have a choice, because they have, as long as they're not psychopaths,
Mhm.
right? they have the they have the emotions, they have the ability. See, that's my point. So the second part of not acting on your emotions, I believe, is there is a play of practical wisdom there.
Mhm.
It takes several iterations of living and understanding that one can get pushed out of a line, that most people who are pushing out of the line are not pushing out of the line because they're trying to be mean to you. It's probably a mistake. And that is a learned behavior. That is practical wisdom.
It comes back to your what you mentioned earlier of the virtuous acts require the requirements of virtuous acts. And the first one I think you mentioned was knowing what one is doing. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Knowledge. That's right.
The
Knowledge.
knowledge. Yeah.
Ah, and a young person cannot. Yes, yes, you're right. Yeah, man, this is beautiful. So that is true. So is it true that in the vertical spectrum, the younger you are, the more likely you are to find yourself in the earlier stages of this, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Then what you said makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And now some people don't grow out of it, but if you are, the more knowledge you gain, the teachings, right, the intellectual aspect, the environments that you're in, all of this creates new perspective. You can gain more knowledge, right? We all gain
Yeah.
knowledge with our years, which is, coming back to Socrates, having a conversation with, I'm forgetting his name, from the Republic, but the father figure,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
And saying, well, you're so wise, you're an elder here, and so he shows his respect to that
Yep.
person, that, in its simplest form, but that's, Socrates, I think, got it of, with age comes wisdom and knowledge and experience. And
Right. Right. That's right. It that's so good. So let me ask you this then. You spoke about the virtuous leader,
Mhm.
right? So if one is on the path of virtue, one is one has knowledge, has choice, lack a secondary gain, is doing these things consistently, finds themselves in a leadership position in an organization. How then can that leader assess the people he is leading and make opportunities across the spectrum? Because that's what Aristotle is trying to say here. You know what I mean? I think you know exactly what I'm saying. Like that's his point. His point is that if one is this virtuous leader, how then do you make everybody around you as a society virtuous?
Yeah. Well, I think Socrates was attempting to do that too, to his
Socrates
own
was saying, yes,
demise. And so, in my simplest answer to that, it's a belief, is that leaders teaching leaders to teach leaders, and that you have great responsibility when other people are following you, and whatever that looks like, right? And to demonstrate both behaviorally, but also, not so in action and behavior, in speech and talk, you're demonstrating what these virtuous acts look like.
mm-hmm.
And if you're a leader, you can expect that from others. And you don't have to, like, I think actually courageous comes in too, and not tolerating those who don't act that way,
mm,
and
mm,
saying in front of everyone, this is not how we do it. How many experiences, Anish, in your lifetime have you experienced? I don't think you'll be able to come up with an answer for this, but how many cancers have you experienced in an organization in
yeah,
in your career?
yeah,
I mean, it exists
every,
everywhere. And then there's
everywhere.
great leaders everywhere as well, right? So
Yeah,
it's, at the end of the day, though, leadership starts at the top. And if they are creating a culture, an environment that also is open to knowledge and experience and inquiry, instead of just taking action all the time, are we actually stopping and asking ourselves, are we doing the right thing?
yeah. The what I'm struggling with is the how. See, the premise of all of this, Aristotle lays down the ground rules, right? That this is intended for those who are seeking and are willing to learn from those who know, right? How does one influence those who, number one, don't know that they don't know and they're unwilling to learn? Because I believe those, based on what I'm hearing from you, the opportunist and the diplomat are in that state.
Mhm.
Then now one is a leader. Now sometimes one can find opportunists and diplomats in leadership,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
I'm sure
Oh,
you
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so then, well, then that, then I don't know how do you manage that, because that is, I'm sure, a lot harder to deal with than if they're further down on the org chart. Um, and so maybe I want to get your views on it. So how do you, maybe you can have an idea on how do you manage the person who's lower down on the org chart? How do you create opportunities for that person to be able to, finally come to some understanding? How do you capitalize on crisis on for that person, number one? And then maybe how do you deal with somebody who is further up in that chain?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's great questions. And I mean, going back to my days of um, experience working with leaders, I mean, starting with there's development programs for everyone, right? You can be an individual contributor and you can take a training that creates some self-awareness. But every leadership program and engagement that I've ever done starts with self-awareness. So it's by building that. And we use 360-degree feedbacks in organizations, right? So you're getting feedback from your peers, from your boss's boss, from other people in the organization. If you have direct reports, from them. So you're getting this full map view that's saying this is how we perceive you. And now that person can choose not to do anything with it, but the chances are they won't be there very long if they don't. I mean, there's plenty of people who have worked their way up, never getting that feedback, and they might be in a culture that is more cutthroat, right? Like you talk like big consulting, right? I mean, it's up or out, and people will do whatever they need to do to move up if that's what they want, and that that type of environment creates a culture of competition, of backstabbing, of these diplomatic and opportunist type of behaviors and ways of viewing the world. And then all of a sudden you become a manager and an executive, and that's no longer considered acceptable. But yet you've been taught how to lead, based on the culture you've been in, right? So
Mhm.
it's the same working with attorneys. It's all cutthroat, and one day, you're constantly competing. You're taught in law school how to argue and debate,
Mhm.
and so you go in, and this is you're kind of all fighting for partnership, and you finally get the partnership, and you have no idea how to actually lead or be a leader, or motivate other people other than what you've already learned, right? So there's cultures that just exist that don't allow that unless you actually build in the opportunity for development in an organization.
I see. I see what you mean. It is hard, and I that's why I find it very difficult to think of this as any other pursuit than pursuit for self improvement. Trying to get anybody else to do this is extremely difficult,
Yeah.
and I would say impossible. But
Mhm.
again, I don't know if that would be the way to go. Saying it's impossible, I don't think anything is impossible, but definitely a lot harder.
Yeah. I've over the years, I typically won't take a coaching client that doesn't want to work on themselves. I don't need that. That's not a good use of my
Hey,
time. I don't want to work with someone who's
right.
saying, no, I don't need that. All right, well, okay, that's fine. That's great. But the fix-its, I don't, I've often been brought in to work with those who needed, like, they were having issues, they needed improvement. And I think it's pretty fascinating. I don't necessarily that I'm not passionate about working with them. I'm passionate about working with those who are doing great and want
Right.
to do better. They're striving for
Yeah.
making themselves the best person they can be. So these people are already on some path, and they're open to feedback. They're open. They're curious. They want to learn. I mean, those are the best types. And I think that at the end of the day, I mean, we talk about real outliers, but the toxicity isn't necessarily, they're outliers too. At the end of the day, it's there are more people, or at least this is my belief, there are more people out there wanting to do good than there are, wanting to, you know, be a bull in a china shop and leave, bunch of dead bodies behind them after, and those people exist, but those might be outliers. Maybe they're sociopaths, maybe they're narcissists, maybe they're
Mm.
right. It's they're not fitting for development. Yeah.
That's an interesting point. And this is my take on this is that yes, you're right. I do believe majority of the people believe they are good people and what they're doing is the right thing to do. Unfortunately, a lot of us are just mistaken. And once we find out what we did was not right, we will change our ways. I believe that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The problem becomes in the meantime, right? And see, the thing about practical wisdom is it takes time. It takes several iterations, and a lot of those iterations are one just coming upon the same problem and same crisis and dealing with it in multiple different ways, or even the same way. You keep hitting your head on the wall. You keep hitting your head on the wall because you want to escape, and your head is hurting and you're bleeding, and all you needed to have done was just walked along the wall and there was a door at the end.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? You just didn't realize it. And then now next time you come upon a wall, you don't butt your head into it. You look for doors,
Yeah.
right? So you solve the problem because you came upon the crisis and you dealt with the crisis. But each time you're hitting your head on the wall, you're getting more frustrated. You're frustrated at walls, the frustrated in the nature of walls and the softness of your head and the situation that brought you there, where all you needed to have done was just walked along the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a silly example. But my point is that if you were to tell that person, why are you hitting your head on the wall, man? They would be, they would not, they would not believe you that there's a door, and all they needed to have done was walk the door. They'd probably get mad at you for interfering, or. So I don't believe they're necessarily, and I was in that same situation myself,
Mm-hmm.
right? And sometimes it's not as objective as there's a door in the wall. Maybe you don't know there's a door in the wall, and and then how do you then lead somebody out of that sense of, because there's suffering in that. I do believe the earlier that one is right in that
Mm-hmm.
in the vertical spectrum, there's
Mm-hmm.
more suffering there is, and as you start going along that spectrum, suffering decreases.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Right? So there's more suffering, and because of that suffering leads to emotion. That emotion leads to acting out of that emotion. That leads to a certain stage of character. That's who you get defined by. I was an angry person. I was all of those things. So that comes with because of the state that you are in, and then suddenly you transcend that, and you get to the next level. You lose that, and you become easier, more amenable. And the
Yeah.
further you get along that, you realize that you don't know anything. There's a point when you
Right.
realize I don't know anything.
That's correct. Yeah.
Right? And then
Yeah.
you're absolutely like clay. Like you could be molded in so many different ways and turned into something else. And that is where people like Lycurgus and Numa suddenly find themselves. And now they understand the nature of what it takes to come to that point. There's a mixture of good fortune, there's a mixture of crisis, there's a mixture of time, and all of those things. And then having the ability to not act on your emotions and all that, all of those things, no one can define exactly what it is that makes somebody want to change. So once you have that, then you have to ask yourself, am I willing to go back now and talk to all of these opportunists and diplomats and tell them that there's light at the end of the tunnel and that they shouldn't behave this way? And rather than, why don't I just look toward the light and keep walking in that direction than going back? You see?
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. And look, at the end of the day, it comes back to, again, like, I think you're talking about, I think this is a journey of the self,
Yeah.
because you and I both have kids. I mean, we can tell them, hey, I've been down that path.
Yeah.
Let's not go down that path. I've been there. I can tell you, did not go well for me. Are they going to listen?
No.
No.
They're probably going to go down.
Maybe if I talk to your kids, if you talk to my kids, maybe they would listen, right?
Maybe they would, yeah.
But they're not going to listen to your parents. But so it's the same, but in it's getting people ready to listen, and that takes time. It takes experience. Sometimes it takes a bad experience or a life-changing event
Absolutely.
that triggers the shift.
Oh, that's a great point. And so maybe the other question to ask yourself is, should one then advise somebody to not go down that path?
Uh,
Because you see what I mean,
yeah.
right? because one has to learn from the mistakes. That's how practical wisdom is formed,
That's right.
right? And I think by shielding people from not making the mistakes, one we stunt their ability to be able to gain practical wisdom, and that leads to more neurosis.
Yes.
There are whole generations that have neurosis because of that reason. They don't know how to deal with just day-to-day struggles
That's
because
right.
one hasn't come across day-to-day struggles. It's a fascinating take on leadership. Should one allow, I think there's another thing to be said, that when one is young, one looks at people who have the experience ahead of them, and one doesn't understand them, and we always blame them, like how is it that these old folks are leading this? We need more young people. They don't understand us. They don't get us.
Right.
And the older folk are looking at these guys, looking the other way down. The younger folks are saying, they are just opportunist diplomats. They don't have the experience. And the people below, but you never know how much experience one has. Everybody believes, till one doesn't have the knowledge, right? One believes that they have the experience.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Knowledge is yes or no. Once you have it, then you realize, oh, I didn't have the experience. Every year I look at back at my year that went by, and I'm like, man, I didn't know anything then. I know more now. But I'm really hoping that when I'm 60, I know a lot more than I know now when I'm in my 40s, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So one doesn't know what one doesn't know. That's one thing.
Right.
And then the younger you are, one believes that there is not that much more to know. I'm an adult.
Right. Yeah. As a younger age, I thought I knew everything. Now I know that I don't know anything.
That's right.
And last year, but I do know I know more now than I did last year, but I
Than you
still
did
know
last
nothing.
year.
Yeah.
But there was a time when I was much younger, when I thought that I knew everything. There was
That's
nothing more
right.
for me to know,
Yeah.
right? And then
Yeah.
that's unfortunately where you are. And so the when you in the Republic, and even in the Nicomachean Ethics, there is something that both Aristotle and Plato say, um, that till one comes to around 40 years of age, one is not ready to participate in
Mm.
something bigger than themselves. Some people get there earlier,
Right.
and those people should be sought after and found. And you can see, so Marcus Aurelius was someone like that.
Mm-hmm.
At a very young age, he exhibited um, maturity way beyond his level.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He was actually chosen, even though he was adopted by the emperor, and he was made the emperor, despite the fact that the emperor had a biological son.
Right.
And when Marcus Aurelius ascended the throne, he split the kingdom in half. He gave half to this other guy because that's the kind of guy he was.
Right.
He gave his own personal wealth during the I think there was a flood or something that he gave his personal wealth to support the citizens of Rome during that. He did things like that. So at a very young age he had those abilities, but not everybody's like that. And I think 40 is the time. So there is a way that you can build organizations around that as a metric. You I see around the dot-com boom and stuff like that, and even with AI and all these things, you see these guys who are in their 20s and they are multi-billionaires now, right? And they're
Yeah.
and they're and they're running the world. Yes, they have in the narrow field of where they are. They're way ahead of everybody else, but they're not broad in their understanding.
No, they're not. No, they're actually very technically. They have technical expertise.
That's right.
They don't have the knowledge and wisdom to be the wealthiest folks in the world and
They're not virtuous
having
agents.
power and control. And yeah.
They're not virtuous agents,
Yeah.
right?
That's right. Yeah.
And that in our organizations, in our spheres of life, I think it's important to find virtuous agents. You are more likely to find them if they are further along in their age and they've had practical wisdom. And I think there are ways to screen for that, and there are ways to evaluate for that. The person that you're choosing for the next role, for a CEO's job or whatever, I think there's an analysis that can be done that says, is this person an opportunist, diplomat,
Mm-hmm.
whatever these other, I forget all the levels are, but
Right.
but you know what I mean? Are they post-conventional or not? And then if someone is post-conventional, the next question to ask them is, why the heck do you want to do this, man?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you'll have some very specific answers that may not be answers at all, but it won't be to benefit themselves.
It cannot be secondary gain.
It will not be secondary gain. It will be to benefit those others, to have a bigger impact in the
Correct.
world, and to be able to connect, to have purpose and, mission, vision focused. Yeah, but it will not be for the sake, for their own sake. That's for sure.
And then obviously it's not for anyone to know. It's only for that agent to know whether that is
Sure.
the case or not, right? But if you find that if there's an assessment to be done to find if one is post conventional, and you have all the objective ways of figuring that out, and they tell you that that's the case, but then all you can do is believe that and then move on from there, right? And then you got to obviously weigh their actions against the actions. So again, this is not supposed to be something that you do outwardly to others. It's about who you are in this space, I think.
Right.
Um, we are I think a little bit more than halfway through, but I think we can probably stop here and
Yeah, I
come
think
back to it,
so.
because this
Yeah.
then goes into the each of those moral virtues and the excesses and the deficiencies and the mean. I think we can discuss that on the next one.
That sounds good. All right.
All right,
Till
Jeremy,
next
thank you.
time. Yeah.
Yep.